He was hailed as a king, paraded through the streets like a living miracle. But behind the powdered wigs and royal robes, something monstrous stirred beneath the surface. His jaw, jutting, twisted, unnaturally long, clanked when he chewed. His tongue was too large for his mouth, forcing a permanent drool. His face, bloated, bruised by nature, seemed to groan under the weight of generations. Charles II of Spain wasn't born. He was assembled. And what emerged was not quite human. This is the grotesque truth about Charles the Bewitched, the inbred king who should never have existed. The curse of blood. Charles II entered the world on November 6, 1661, in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. He was Spain's long-awaited heir, the miracle child of King Philip IV and his second wife, who was also his niece, Mariana of Austria. From the moment he emerged, there were whispers that the baby didn't cry, that his skin had a waxy bluish tint, that he didn't move the way a newborn should, and that his eyes were far too far apart. But in public, he was celebrated, baptized with all the pomp of the Spanish court, hailed as Carlos el Hechizado, Charles the Bewitched, a nickname that would cling to him like a curse. Because Charles II wasn't just a sickly infant, he was a genetic time bomb. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty had been interbreeding for over 200 years. First cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The family tree didn't branch, it spiraled inward, coiling tighter and tighter until it birthed Charles, a walking compendium of every hereditary defect that centuries of incest could offer. Let's talk genetics, grotesque and royal. Charles's mother, Mariana, was not just his mother, she was also his first cousin once removed. And his father, Philip? He had married his own niece. In fact, Charles's own family had so few distinct bloodlines that by the time he was born, his genetic coefficient of inbreeding was 0.254. That's the equivalent of a child born to siblings, not cousins, siblings. That means that 1 in 4 of Charles's gene pairs were completely homozygous, carbon copies of the same defective gene passed down by both parents. The damage was baked into his bones. He was a royal experiment in how far a dynasty could collapse before it finally caved in on itself, and the results were horrifying. As he grew, the rumors multiplied. He couldn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak until he was 8. His tongue was so large he could barely be understood when he tried. He drooled constantly, and when he did manage to talk, the words came out as a garbled mumble, soaked in spit. His face was warped by the notorious Habsburg jaw, a protruding, jutting mandible that made chewing nearly impossible. But Charles's case was the worst yet. His jaw was so misaligned, so oversized, that he could not close his mouth. Eating became a kind of performance art, food shoved in, gnashed clumsily, half swallowed whole. Doctors called it mandibular prognathism, but the peasants had simpler words for it. They said the king was cursed, but the physical deformities were only the beginning. Inside Charles's skull, something even darker festered. The rot within. By the time Charles was 10, it was clear to everyone at court. He was not just malformed. He was missing something. He couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't focus. He stared at walls for hours, his mouth slightly open, the drool pooling on his doublet. He had no concept of money, geography, diplomacy, or war. In council meetings, he sat silent, eyes wandering, tongue twitching, while ministers spoke around him as if he weren't there. But he was there, watching, suffering, trapped in a body that disobeyed him and a mind that betrayed him. Behind palace doors, his caretakers whispered that the boy king had the intellect of a 6-year-old. Behind closed church doors, the priests had darker suspicions. The child, they claimed, was not merely slow, he was bewitched. And in 17th century Spain, that wasn't metaphor, it was doctrine. The court was convinced that Charles was the victim of maleficium, evil magic, that some heretic, some Moorish servant, some French agent had hexed the boy in his cradle. Exorcists were brought in, holy water was splashed, prayers were mumbled over the writhing, confused king. They made him drink oils, sleep under crosses, and wear shirts soaked in relics. One friar swore he saw Charles's body jerk violently as demons left his spine. But the seizures didn't stop, because there were no demons, just broken genetics and a collapsing nervous system. Historians now believe Charles II suffered from multiple undiagnosed disorders: hydrocephalus, pituitary dysfunction, and possibly Klinefelter syndrome. His limbs were weak and uneven, his spine curved unnaturally. His eyes, dull, listless, struggled to track motion. He suffered near-constant pain from chronic infections, tooth decay, and ulcers, and yet they made him king. At just 4 years old, he was handed the crown, not because he was capable, but because there was no one else left. The Habsburg bloodline was so spent, so depleted, that Charles was the final flickering ember of the Spanish throne. His mother ruled in his name for decades, but behind every royal decree, behind every war, treaty, and purge, was the broken boy, smiling blankly, fingers trembling, eyes empty. The throne of Spain had become a tomb, and Charles its living corpse. The failed experiments. Charles II was a man doomed by design, but his greatest failure, at least in the eyes of his court, wasn't his vacant stare or twisted jaw. It was his failure to do the one thing his mutilated bloodline demanded: create another monster. He was their final hope, the last malformed ember of the Habsburg line. He didn't need to be wise, or strong, or sane. He just had to breed. So at age 18, Charles was married off to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess chosen for her youth, beauty, and more than anything, her uterus. She was 17, bright-eyed, and devout. She knew what was expected of her. Spain needed a prince. But the moment the doors shut behind them on their wedding night, the reality became clear. Charles was incapable. There are no polite words for it. He didn't know how. Or perhaps he knew, but his body didn't obey. He would crawl into bed with Marie-Louise, trembling, sweating, his tongue lolling out the side of his mouth like a hound. Then, nothing. Not even confusion. Just silence. Awkward, drooling silence. At court, the whispers began almost immediately. One ambassador reported that Charles seemed more like a child of 10 than a man of 20. Another wrote in horror, "He cannot mount a horse, nor mount a woman." The king's minders were humiliated. Something had to be done. And so began a series of rituals that blurred the line between medical treatment and medieval sorcery. Charles was forced to ingest aphrodisiac potions, concoctions of ground deer penis, goat liver, and vulture brains soaked in wine. Monks blessed his loins with holy oils. Surgeons examined his genitals, sometimes in public, documenting their lifelessness like a coroner inspecting a corpse. And still no heir, not even a miscarriage. Marie-Louise's womb remained untouched. She withered under the weight of it. Her hair fell out. Her eyes hollowed. She stopped eating. Whether it was heartbreak, starvation, or some subtle poison administered by those who blamed her for the failure, it ended the same. In 1689, she collapsed and died at the age of 26. An autopsy claimed stomach complications. The servants claimed they saw her soul escape, but Spain did not weep. They simply replaced her. In 1690, Charles married again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess whose family had a reputation for extraordinary fertility. She had 12 siblings. Her sisters had dozens of children. Surely, the court reasoned, if anyone could wring life from the king's dying loins, it would be her. They were wrong. Maria Anna was shocked by what she saw on their wedding night. Charles, now 29, had aged into a withered husk. His breath reeked of rot. His limbs spasmed. His skin was a tapestry of sores. She later wrote, "He sleeps with his mouth open, and a sound escapes him like a dying animal." Charles tried. In his own stumbling, broken way, he tried. He entered her chambers night after night, drooling and stammering, collapsing onto her with the stiffness of rigor mortis, but there was no warmth, no function, just dead meat pretending to be a man. The court became desperate. Priests were summoned, then exorcists, then witches. One healer had him sleep with a chalice of holy water tied to his genitals. Another insisted the queen bathe in his urine. They forced Charles to consume wax sealed with the Virgin Mary's image. When that failed, they smeared holy oil on his stomach and screamed Latin into his belly button. Nothing worked, because nothing could work. Charles's body was not a vessel for life. It was a biological tomb, the endpoint of a dynasty that had long ago traded vitality for purity. His sperm, if it existed at all, carried the corrupted script of centuries of incest. There would be no child, no heir, no salvation. Spain would fall with him. The face of a dying dynasty. Charles II was a walking warning sign. His body didn't just whisper that something was wrong. It screamed. To look at him was to witness the slow-motion collapse of a dynasty in human flesh. He had the signature Habsburg jaw, but his was beyond exaggerated. It protruded so grotesquely that his upper and lower teeth could not touch. He could barely chew. His meals were either mashed to paste or swallowed nearly whole. His tongue, swollen, oversized, sluggish. It filled his mouth like a bloated slug, slurring his words, forcing him to speak with thick, spitting difficulty. Often he didn't even try. It was easier to groan, or gesture, or say nothing at all. His eyes, sluggish and unfocused, seemed too far apart. A condition we now call hypertelorism. They gave him the look of someone always slightly detached from the moment, staring just past whoever was speaking. He blinked slowly, too slowly, as if his brain were always half a second behind his body. And then there were his limbs. His arms trembled when he lifted a goblet. His legs dragged when he walked. He suffered frequent falls, seizures, and paralytic episodes that left him motionless for hours at a time. His spine curved unnaturally. His hands, when still, were always curled inward, as if clutching invisible pain. Doctors described him with a mix of pity and clinical detachment. One wrote, "His bones are like chalk. His stomach rejects meat. His heart is quick to tire." His skin, grey, blotchy, oily, covered in open sores that refused to heal. Some blamed it on his royal diet. Others said it was divine punishment. But the truth was simpler. His body was running on bad code, and then in 1700 it finally stopped. Charles died at the age of 38, after a final few years of near-total mental and physical collapse. He could no longer walk. He could no longer speak. In the last days, he soiled himself constantly, forgetting where he was, who he was, or why people kept crying around him. The bells of Madrid tolled for him like they were burying a saint. But when the royal physicians opened his corpse, they found something far more disturbing. The autopsy was kept secret at first, the findings too strange, too damning. But eventually the report leaked, and here's what it said. His body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were putrefied and gangrenous. His head was full of water. Let that sink in. No blood, a shriveled heart, rotting intestines, a skull filled with fluid. This wasn't a man. This was a relic in real time, a royal Frankenstein staggering from one ritual to the next, stitched together from the broken DNA of too many royal cousins. Science now points to possible hydrocephalus, renal failure, testicular atrophy, and severe endocrine dysfunctions. But no diagnosis is needed to know the truth. He was never built to survive. His very existence was a violation of nature, and when nature had finally had enough, it made sure the Habsburg line ended with a whisper and a wet collapse. The fall of a kingdom. Charles II didn't just rule a crumbling kingdom, he was the crumbling kingdom. Every tick, tremor, and drool-soaked whisper mirrored the condition of Spain itself, a once mighty empire now rotting from the inside, hollowed by greed, war, and the poison of a bloodline that had folded in on itself. At the height of Habsburg power, Spain had commanded the world. Gold from the New World, armadas on the seas, colonies on every continent. But by the time Charles sat on the throne, the empire was held together by ritual and rot. He couldn't speak in court, and Spain could no longer speak with strength abroad. He couldn't father a child, and Spain couldn't produce a single lasting victory. He sat motionless in a palace of ghosts, while the world around him caught fire. In the final years of his life, Charles became a pawn, passed between factions like a sacred but broken idol. His wife, Maria Anna, ran one faction. The Austrian Habsburgs ran another. The French pushed from the outside, ministers from within. Ambassadors took bets on when he would die, and who would rise from his ashes. Spain was no longer a kingdom. It was a corpse with many vultures. The moment Charles died in 1700, the question of his successor ignited a conflict that would burn Europe for over a decade. The War of the Spanish Succession broke out like a fever, because Charles, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, had no heir, no plan, and no functioning organs. He had written a will, of course, but even that was confused. He'd changed his mind under pressure, switching allegiances from the Austrians to the French and back again, sometimes in the same month. One ambassador wrote, "He has become a vessel for others' words. His will is not his own." In the end, Charles left the Spanish crown to Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince, and the grandson of France's King Louis XIV. This enraged the Austrians and terrified the English, who feared a unified France and Spain under one bloodline. And so, the war began. It killed hundreds of thousands. It scorched cities. It shattered alliances. The fighting spilled from Spain to Italy, the Netherlands, the Americas. Spain lost territories, influence, and wealth, all because a man who should never have lived had died exactly as he was made to. Charles's corpse didn't just end a dynasty, it cracked the spine of an empire. His body had been the warning sign, his reign, the death rattle, his childlessness, the final nail. And with his last breath, Europe learned what happens when power is bred too pure and too long. A legacy of madness. Most kings leave behind monuments. Charles II left behind a warning, not a legend of glory or conquest or law, but a living, rotting example of what happens when power forgets biology. When royal bloodlines twist themselves into knots so tight, they strangle the mind before birth. His story was studied, not celebrated. His body, once entombed with ceremony, was later dissected by historians, physicians, and geneticists alike. Not for reverence, but for autopsy. The term the Habsburg jaw would be forever tied to him, medical shorthand for the deformity of generations, now used as a textbook example of mandibular prognathism, in which the lower jaw juts forward like a mechanical vice. For Charles, it was so extreme, he couldn't eat without choking. Modern science went further. In the 21st century, researchers used centuries of Habsburg portraits, over 600 paintings, to track the slow visual degradation of the family's features. And what did they find? As inbreeding increased, so did the deformities. Wider jaws, longer faces, flattened skulls, squinting, unfocused eyes. And in Charles II's case, a genetic collapse so complete, some experts argue he may have had more shared DNA than the offspring of siblings. He wasn't just a product of inbreeding. He was the final result of it, a biological dead end. And so Charles's image became political propaganda. Enlightenment thinkers would use his grotesque features as proof that monarchies, especially hereditary ones, were doomed by their own delusions. Revolutionaries in France and Spain pointed to his portrait and said, "This is what your kings become when you bow for too long." Even the church, once quick to defend him as a victim of witchcraft, quietly buried his story under centuries of silence. The exorcisms, the rituals, the urine-based fertility rites. These details became embarrassments, whispered footnotes in dusty archives, but not forgotten. In art, he appeared as the withered king, the cursed monarch, the child in a crown too heavy for his skull. In psychology, he became a case study in arrested development, trauma, and the effects of chronic physical suffering on identity. In genetics, he is still cited in medical journals under the Habsburg anomaly. And in every history classroom that dares to show his portrait, a silence always follows, a silence filled with unease, because Charles II wasn't just a broken man, he was a mirror. A mirror showing us what happens when human beings become symbols, when bloodlines matter more than brains, when the idea of royalty survives long after the body carrying it has begun to decompose. Resurrection by infamy. History tried to bury him, but Charles II refused to stay buried. Not his body, it rotted swiftly, but his image, his deformity, his legacy. They've come back to life in a way no king would envy. Centuries after his death, Charles has become an accidental celebrity in the age of algorithms. His twisted portrait, once the guarded shame of a royal house, now circulates online as meme fodder, labeled the most inbred man in history, the human error message, a face only monarchy could love. People laugh, but the unease always lingers, because the face doesn't look real. It looks sculpted in wax or clay by a student who didn't understand symmetry. The jaw juts too far, the lips hang too low, the gaze is too empty, and yet it's all real. Every detail carefully painted from life by court artists who dared not flinch at what they saw. Now his image is reanimated for entertainment, used in horror games, referenced in true crime podcasts, discussed in Reddit rabbit holes about cursed genetics. On YouTube, titles like "The Most Deformed King in History" rack up millions of views. His autopsy is quoted in voiceovers like scripture: no blood, a heart like a peppercorn, a head full of water. And why? Because Charles represents something modernity still fears. The idea that with all our power, status and knowledge, we could still produce something so broken. Geneticists study his lineage in new ways, applying DNA models, inbreeding coefficients, mitochondrial failure charts. Some have even simulated what his children might have looked like if he'd succeeded in reproducing. The results are monstrous. Fiction writers have turned him into myth. In alternate histories and horror stories, Charles II is reborn as a haunted monarch, a cursed soul, a psychic ruin. One story reimagines him as the vessel for an ancient parasite. Another paints his court as a Lovecraftian hell, where every advisor wears masks to avoid looking at the king directly. In these stories, his deformities are never just physical. They're symbols of stagnation, decay, and blind obedience to tradition. He has become the ghost of monarchy, a lingering warning that kings are not gods and dynasties are not divine. They are meat, bone, blood. And when those are bred wrong, the result is not majesty but mutation. Charles II of Spain is no longer just a footnote in royal history. He is a modern myth, the king who died broken and somehow became immortal anyway. The crown in the coffin. And the heart of El Escorial, a royal mausoleum carved into stone and silence, lies the tomb of Charles II of Spain. A marble coffin, pristine, regal. But beneath that cold perfection is something unspeakable. Not a king, not a man, but a symbol of everything a throne should fear. He died without glory, without heirs, without understanding. A body collapsed by its own blood, a mind strangled in the womb, a legacy soaked in humiliation and whispered prayers that it would end with him. And it did. With Charles, the Spanish Habsburg line ceased to exist. His body was the last note in a song too long and too discordant, a symphony of intermarriage, arrogance, and religious obsession played until the strings snapped. But his story did not end, because Charles haunts history. He is the cautionary tale carved in royal portraits, the malformed shadow behind every gilded throne, the proof that power cannot rewrite genetics and that legacy means nothing if the flesh carrying it cannot survive. In Charles, we see the grotesque truth of unchecked tradition, how the obsession with purity, legacy, and divine right can twist a child into a biological experiment, and how entire nations will look away, pretend it's normal, wrap it in silks and gold and call it majesty. Even now, centuries later, he waits in his coffin, not as a ruler, not as a monarch, but as a warning. A crown too heavy for a skull filled with water, a body so broken even death had to wait patiently, a dynasty so arrogant it collapsed into a single man who should never have been born.